Beneath the blazing golden sunset, Evelyn stood in the heart of a boundless field of wildflowers, the gentle breeze carrying the familiar scent of her homeland. She had always adored the countryside, its endless fields, the dawn chorus of chirping birds, and the earthy aroma of damp soil after a morning rain. It was here, in this very place, that she'd spent a joyful childhood, learning to nurture plants under the tender guidance of her mother and grandfather. But those carefree days had long since faded, replaced by the weight of responsibility. Evelyn's grandfather, once the sturdy pillar of their small family, had grown frail with age. His health deteriorated rapidly, and the cost of his care soared beyond their means. The modest savings that had once sustained their simple life were no longer enough to cover medicine and hospital bills. Her mother worked tirelessly, but the burden was crushing. It was clear, if their family was to survive, someone had to change their circumstances. Determined to forge a better future, Evelyn made the hardest decision of her life: to leave her beloved countryside and venture into the city. It was a world foreign to her, a place where money flowed endlessly, but was riddled with challenges and uncertainties. She packed light, a small suitcase with a few simple outfits, a notebook filled with sketches and notes about plants, and, most importantly, a heart brimming with hope. The city was overwhelming. Towering skyscrapers swallowed the vast sky she once knew. The roar of traffic drowned out nature's soothing melodies, and people rushed by, their faces etched with the worries of urban life. Those first days were brutal: countless job rejections, sleepless nights in a cramped rented room, and a creeping fear of failure that gnawed at her spirit. But Evelyn refused to give up. She knew she carried a rare gift. All she needed was the right chance. After relentless rejection, luck finally turned her way. A small residential community was seeking a gardener. The interview was short and straightforward, conducted by Mrs. Clara, the kind-hearted manager of the complex. The older woman took an instant liking to Evelyn, sensing the genuine passion within her. "You've got something special," Mrs. Clara said with a warm smile. "This job is yours." Evelyn threw herself into the work immediately. Though the garden wasn't large, she tended to it with all her heart and dedication. Her hands seemed to work miracles. Wilted flowers stretched tall and vibrant once more. Barren shrubs flourished greener than ever. She shared a unique bond with the plants, as if they understood and returned the love she poured into them. It didn't take long for the residents to notice the transformation. "This garden has never looked so alive," they marveled as they strolled along the lush pathways. The forgotten patches of green became the pride of the community, a haven where people gathered to relax and bask in nature's embrace. With each passing day, Evelyn didn't just breathe life into the garden, she won the hearts of those around her. Hesitant smiles and polite nods evolved into warm greetings and heartfelt compliments. For her, this wasn't just a job, it was a way to bring joy, not only to the plants, but to the people who cherished them. Even as her work thrived, Evelyn never lost sight of her purpose. She took on extra gardening jobs for nearby households, sending every penny she earned back to her mother. Each letter home carried a promise: better days are coming. But she knew the road ahead was still long. Gardening was no easy task, and tending to others' gardens demanded not just skill, but patience and unwavering devotion. Yet Evelyn had never been one to back down. One morning, as she carefully pruned a bed of roses, Mrs. Clara approached her, an envelope in hand. "Evelyn, dear," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement, "this is a special invitation. Mr. Nathaniel Hayes, the owner of the mansion on the hill, has heard of your reputation. He wants you to tend his garden. They say the pay there is generous." Evelyn's heart raced. She'd heard of Nathaniel Hayes, a wealthy, reclusive man. His mansion was one of the city's most prestigious estates, though few had ever met its mysterious owner. This was the opportunity she'd been waiting for, a chance to earn enough to care for her grandfather and bring stability to her family. Taking a deep breath, she nodded, her eyes blazing with resolve. "I'll take the job." Little did she know, this decision would change her life forever. Evelyn stood before the towering iron gates of the Hayes mansion, a place long shrouded in mystery as one of the city's most enigmatic estates. A pristine gravel path stretched ahead, flanked by ancient trees casting dappled shadows. The morning sunlight slipped through the leaves, painting the ground with flickering patches of gold. This place felt different from the lively gardens she'd tended before. It radiated solitude, stillness, and an air of secrets untold. She took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. This was the greatest opportunity of her life. The gates creaked open slowly, and a middle-aged man stepped forward, dressed in a crisp black suit. His presence was polished yet imposing. "Are you Evelyn Carter?" he asked, his voice low and firm. "Yes, sir. I'm Benson, the butler of this estate. Follow me. The master is waiting." Evelyn trailed behind Benson as they crossed a sprawling yet neglected garden. Though signs of neglect were evident, she could still see the hidden beauty in every corner. The winding shaded paths, the faded flower beds that once bloomed brilliantly, and the weathered statues cloaked in moss. She could already imagine what she might do to breathe life back into this place. Stepping inside the mansion, Evelyn was struck by its grandeur. Soaring ceilings glittered with crystal chandeliers, walls adorned with aged paintings, and a long hallway lined with plush red carpet stretched into the distance. Yet what caught her most was the eerie silence that hung in the air. Benson led her to a vast room where a man stood by the window, gazing out at the garden. The dim light outlined his tall frame, accentuating his broad shoulders and quiet demeanor. Benson bowed. "Sir Hayes, the new gardener has arrived." The man turned. Nathaniel Hayes. Evelyn had heard of him. A wealthy businessman who shunned the public eye. Rumors swirled about him endlessly. Some called him a genius in the world of commerce, others a cold, heartless recluse. But one thing everyone agreed on: he lived in complete isolation within these walls. What stunned her wasn't his reputation, but the look in his eyes when they met hers. Shock, pain, nostalgia. Nathaniel froze as if he'd just seen a ghost. For a fleeting moment, the room drowned in absolute silence. Evelyn's mind raced with confusion. He was staring at her as though they'd met before, but how could that be? Nathaniel quickly regained his composure. His voice, deep and slightly hoarse, perhaps from disuse, cut through the stillness. "You're Evelyn Carter?" "Yes, sir." He studied her for a long moment before continuing. "Benson will show you the garden. You can start work tomorrow." Evelyn nodded her thanks and left the room, but she couldn't shake the memory of Nathaniel's strange, piercing gaze, a look heavy with sorrow, as if she'd unwittingly stirred a memory buried deep in his past. As Benson guided her through the garden, Evelyn noticed the staff here were few, each one guarded and tight-lipped. After the tour, Benson left her to explore alone. She wandered the gravel paths, the rustling leaves whispering in the breeze. Then she caught a faint murmur from two maids nearby. "She looks exactly like—" "Quiet. If the master hears, it won't end well." Evelyn frowned. "Exactly like who?" She turned, but the maids had already scurried off. The mystery surrounding Nathaniel Hayes and why he'd looked at her so strangely grew more puzzling by the minute. That night, back in her tiny rented room, Evelyn couldn't sleep. Nathaniel's face haunted her thoughts. She resolved to dig deeper. Scrolling through old articles online, she uncovered a startling piece of his past. Over 20 years ago, Nathaniel had been deeply in love with a woman named Lillian Monroe, a beautiful girl from the countryside with an unyielding passion for nature and plants. Evelyn's heart pounded. The similarities between her and Lillian were undeniable. It wasn't just their looks. It was their shared love for the natural world, their roots in rural life, even the way she'd stumbled into this mansion. It all felt like an echo of Lillian's story. A chill ran down her spine. Could this resemblance be more than mere coincidence? She realized that stepping through the gates of the Hayes mansion had pulled her into an unfinished tale, and there was only one way to uncover the truth: to delve deeper into Nathaniel Hayes's world. She took a steadying breath, resolve hardening within her. Tomorrow she'd begin her work at the mansion, and tomorrow the secrets of the past would start to unravel. The faint light of dawn filtered through the ancient trees as Evelyn Carter stepped into the sprawling garden of the Hayes mansion. She'd arrived earlier than planned, eager to take in her new workspace and feel its essence. A thin mist still clung to the grass, casting an ethereal, almost dreamlike glow over the scene. Wilted flowers, overgrown shrubs, and moss-covered statues stretched before her, remnants of a place that had once been magnificent, but now lay forgotten. Evelyn gently brushed her fingers against a nearby rose. Its leaves were rough and brittle, a testament to years of neglect. "What a shame," she murmured, silently vowing to restore this garden to its former glory. "I thought so too." A warm, deep voice from behind startled her, and she spun around. Nathaniel Hayes stood there, dressed in a dark grey suit. Today he seemed less aloof than the day before, though his eyes still carried an inscrutable sadness. Evelyn straightened quickly, flustered by the unexpected presence of her employer so early in the morning. "Mr. Hayes," she said with a slight nod, "I didn't realize you cared about the garden." Nathaniel gave a faint smile, but didn't respond immediately. His gaze swept over the garden, as if peering into a distant memory. "Many years ago," he said slowly, "this garden was the most beautiful part of the estate. But time, and things that happened, left it like this." Evelyn stayed silent, watching him closely. She could sense that this garden was more than just land to him. It held memories he'd buried deep. Nathaniel turned to her, his eyes probing. "Do you think you can bring it back to life?" Evelyn smiled, feeling a spark of challenge in his words for the first time. I don't think. I know I can." In the days that followed, Evelyn threw herself into her work with unrelenting passion and dedication. She spent hours pruning rose bushes, reviving the soil, and replanting flower beds that had once dazzled with color. She explored every corner of the garden, uncovering hidden paths and time-worn statues buried beneath years of overgrowth. But what lingered in her mind most wasn't the garden itself, it was the way Nathaniel looked at her. Why did he always seem so startled when their eyes met? And it wasn't just him. The staff at the mansion acted oddly too. Some avoided her entirely, while others whispered behind her back. One evening, as she watered plants near an ancient fountain, Evelyn overheard two maids talking. "She looks exactly like—" "Shush, if the master hears, we're in trouble." Evelyn's heart raced. Exactly like who? She knew she'd stumbled into an unfinished story. One day, while clearing out an abandoned greenhouse at the garden's edge, Evelyn stumbled upon an old dust-covered wooden box. Inside were a few weathered items, a yellowed letter, a wooden comb, and, most striking of all, a crescent moon necklace. Her heart stopped. This necklace. It was identical to the one her mother had given her as a child. Why was it here? With trembling hands, she unfolded the letter. The ink had faded with time, but the words were still legible. "My dearest Nathaniel, I know we can't be together, but my heart will always belong to you. If you ever find this letter, please forgive me, and know that no matter what, I love you more than anything in this world. Lillian." Lillian, a chill swept through Evelyn. That name, it was her mother's. Her legs faltered, her breath quickened. It couldn't be. She had to find Nathaniel, now. Evelyn rushed to the mansion's grand library, where Nathaniel stood reading. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice tight with urgency, "I need to ask you something." Nathaniel set his book down, raising an eyebrow. "What is it?" Evelyn held up the necklace. This. Why was it in the garden? Nathaniel stared at it, and in an instant, his face drained of color. Where did you find that? His voice was hoarse. Evelyn swallowed hard. In an old wooden box in the greenhouse. There was a letter, too, from someone named Lillian. Nathaniel's hand clenched, his eyes flashing with the storm of emotions he'd suppressed for years. Lillian, she was... Evelyn locked eyes with him. She was my mother. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Nathaniel seemed unable to process her words. You're Lillian's daughter? Evelyn nodded. A flicker of agony crossed Nathaniel's face before he turned away, as if struggling to hold back the memories he'd locked away for so long. This, he muttered. It can't be. Evelyn tightened her fists and took a deep breath. Mr. Hayes, I want the whole truth. About my mother, about you, and about why I'm here. Nathaniel looked at her for a long, heavy moment. Then, with a voice weighed down by years of pain, he said, All right, Evelyn, it's time you knew everything. The air in the library grew heavy, almost suffocating. Evelyn's heart pounded as she watched Nathaniel Hayes's face flood with emotion. He stood motionless, staring at the crescent moon necklace in her hand, his eyes a storm of shock, pain, and longing. Mr. Hayes, Evelyn began slowly, my mother, Lillian Monroe. She was part of your life, wasn't she? Nathaniel closed his eyes as if trying to hold back the tidal wave of feelings surging within him. When he opened them again, the cold detachment she'd once seen was gone, replaced by a gaze brimming with memories he'd buried for decades. Yes, he whispered. Lillian was the only love of my life. Evelyn held her breath. She'd suspected some of the truth, but hearing Nathaniel confirm it still hit her like a thunderbolt. He stepped toward the window, gazing out at the garden slowly coming back to life under Evelyn's care. His voice was low, layered with distant echoes of the past. I met your mother right here in this garden, he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips, tinged with profound regret. She came from the countryside, carrying a fierce love for nature. I fell for her the moment I saw her. Evelyn listened in silence, feeling every pulse of emotion in his words. We planned a future together. But then, something happened. Nathaniel turned to face her, his eyes holding a pain that had never faded. One day, Lillian left this mansion and never came back. Evelyn frowned. She didn't even say goodbye. Nathaniel shook his head. Not a word, not a note. She vanished completely, as if she'd never existed. Evelyn clutched the necklace tighter. What had really happened to her mother? Nathaniel walked to his desk and pulled a small mahogany box from a drawer. He opened it carefully, revealing a few faded photographs and a yellowed letter. After Lillian left, I searched for her everywhere, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I went to her hometown, asked everyone I could find, but no one knew where she'd gone. Evelyn picked up the letter from the box and unfolded it with care. Her mother's elegant yet resolute handwriting stared back at her from the weathered page. Nathaniel, if you're reading this, it means fate has given us another chance to meet. But before that happens, there's something you need to know. Forgive me for leaving without an explanation. I had no other choice. The only one I wanted to protect was our daughter. Evelyn's heart clenched. Her mother had left to protect her. But why? She looked up at Nathaniel, who stood frozen, reeling from the words she'd just read aloud. I have a child. His voice cracked, disbelief warring with realization. Evelyn gripped the letter tightly, a swell of emotions crashing through her. And that child is me. The room plunged into a suffocating silence. Evelyn's hands shook as she set the letter on the table. It was all too much to process. Nathaniel stared at her, his eyes a kaleidoscope of shock, anguish, regret, and a fragile glimmer of hope. You're Lillian's daughter? he repeated, as if anchoring himself to this new reality. Evelyn nodded, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She raised me alone, but she never told me about you. Nathaniel staggered back a step, as if the world he'd known had shifted in an instant. Lillian, why did you keep this from me? He murmured, his fists clenching. Evelyn's mind swirled with questions. If her mother had loved Nathaniel so deeply, why had she left him? Why had she chosen to raise her alone instead of giving her a complete family? Suddenly, Benson, the loyal butler, spoke up. Perhaps she didn't leave by choice, but because she was forced to. Both Evelyn and Nathaniel whipped around to face him. Benson bowed his head, his voice dropping low. There was someone who didn't want Lillian to become part of the Hayes family. A chill raced down Evelyn's spine. Who? Nathaniel demanded, his tone sharp as steel. Benson hesitated, then sighed. Your father, sir. Arthur Hayes. Nathaniel fell silent. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Arthur Hayes, his father, a powerful businessman known for his ruthlessness. A man who never tolerated anything that didn't fit his grand designs. Did he force Lillian to leave? Nathaniel asked, his voice thick with fury. Benson nodded. Mr. Arthur discovered your relationship, and he wouldn't accept a common girl joining the Hayes lineage. He threatened Lillian, forced her to leave without warning. Evelyn's heart twisted painfully. Her mother hadn't left willingly, she'd been driven away. Nathaniel stood motionless. All those years of torment, it seemed, stemmed from his own father. Anger and grief surged within Evelyn. So my mother sacrificed everything just to protect me? Her voice broke. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment before speaking softly. Evelyn, I lost your mother once. I won't lose you too. Evelyn met his gaze, and for the first time in her life, she felt a warmth she'd never known. A connection she'd been missing. We'll uncover the full truth, she said, her voice steady with resolve. And above all, we won't let the past tear us apart again. She reached out and took his hand, because now she was no longer alone. The first rays of morning sunlight slipped through the grand windows of the Hayes mansion, illuminating the garden as it blossomed back to life. Crimson roses stretched toward the sky in the gentle breeze, while rows of lavender unfurled their soothing fragrance across the grounds. Evelyn Carter stood in the wide courtyard, quietly taking it all in. She was no longer just the unknown gardener who'd arrived here weeks ago. Now she was Nathaniel Hayes's daughter, a part of a family she'd never known existed. But even with the truth uncovered, one question lingered in her heart. How could they heal the wounds the past had left behind? Nathaniel stepped up beside her, his gaze softer than she'd ever seen it. Thank you for giving me this chance, he said quietly. I know it won't be easy to make up for the years we've lost, but I want to try. Evelyn gave a small smile. So do I. Together they looked out at the garden, where flowers bloomed vibrantly, a symbol of a fresh beginning. After many conversations with Nathaniel, Evelyn decided to return to her countryside home to see her mother, Lillian Monroe. Though Lillian had hidden the truth for years, Evelyn understood that every choice she'd made stemmed from love and protection. I want Mum to come here, Evelyn said to Nathaniel over breakfast in the mansion's grand dining room. She spent her life shielding me. Now it's time we take care of her. Nathaniel set his teacup down, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before it settled into determination. I agree, he said with a nod. Lillian deserves the peaceful days she never had. 3 days later, Evelyn and Nathaniel set out from the city, heading toward the countryside where it had all begun. Lillian Monroe's modest home sat nestled amid endless green fields, where soft winds carried the scents of wildflowers and grass. Evelyn's heart raced as she stood before the weathered wooden door. She'd waited for this moment far too long. Taking a deep breath, she knocked gently. The door creaked open, and there stood Lillian, her figure still graceful, her eyes a sea of memories and emotions. They widened when she saw Nathaniel Hayes beside Evelyn. "Lillian." Nathaniel's voice was almost a whisper, thick with feeling. Lillian stepped back, her hand trembling. "Nathaniel, is it really you?" Evelyn couldn't hold back any longer. "Mom," she choked out, "I know everything." Lillian looked at her daughter, then at Nathaniel. Her eyes brimmed with emotion, as if she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "I'm sorry, Evelyn. I'm so sorry for keeping this secret for so long." Evelyn stepped forward and took her mother's hand. "You don't need to apologize. I just want you to be happy." Nathaniel, the man who'd once thought he'd lost the love of his life forever, stood there, struggling to hold back the tears he'd suppressed for decades. "I searched for you," he whispered. "I never stopped loving you, Lillian." Lillian sobbed, clutching Nathaniel's hand, as if afraid he'd vanish again if she let go. "And I never stopped loving you." In that moment, past and present converged, old wounds melting away in the warmth of a tender embrace. After untangling every knot of misunderstanding, Lillian agreed to return to the Hayes mansion with Evelyn and Nathaniel. The first days weren't easy. Lillian was used to the simplicity of rural life, while Nathaniel was still learning to open his heart after years of solitude. But they were trying, and that was what mattered most. Evelyn spent her days in the garden, tending to each flower bed, as if nurturing her own family back to wholeness. Nathaniel, meanwhile, took small steps to adjust to having Lillian and Evelyn in his life again. One evening, as the family shared dinner by candlelight in the grand dining room, Nathaniel suddenly stood. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Turning to Lillian, his eyes shone with sincerity. "Lillian," he said, his voice warm and steady, "we lost each other once, but I don't want to lose you again." Evelyn held her breath as Nathaniel knelt down. "Will you marry me and let us finish the story we left behind?" Lillian burst into tears. She gazed at him for a long moment before nodding, a radiant smile breaking through her tears. "Yes." Evelyn couldn't hold back her own tears of joy. At last, her family was whole. Not long after, Nathaniel Hayes and Lillian Monroe held a small, intimate wedding in the very garden where their paths had once diverged. Evelyn stood beside her mother, watching her glow in a simple yet elegant wedding dress. Her heart swelled with warmth, because she knew love had finally triumphed. After years torn apart by misunderstandings and pain, they'd found their way back to each other. And more than that, Evelyn had discovered the family she never dreamed she'd have. As the bells rang out to mark the sacred moment, Nathaniel squeezed Lillian's hand, and Evelyn beamed with a smile brighter than the sun. From this day forward, they would no longer be solitary souls. The early morning sun cast its golden rays over the sprawling garden of the Hayes mansion, a place once cloaked in gloom, now bursting with vibrant life under Evelyn Carter's devoted care. Crimson roses bloomed boldly, purple lavender stretched in fragrant rows, and lush green trees painted a picture of nature reborn. Evelyn sat on the stone steps, gazing at the garden she'd poured her heart into restoring. It wasn't just a job anymore. It was home. In the distance, Nathaniel Hayes chatted with a new gardener he'd hired to lighten Evelyn's load. "She's the best I've ever met," Nathaniel said, his voice brimming with pride as he glanced at her. Evelyn smiled softly. She never imagined the day would come when this once reclusive man would open up and radiate such warmth. Inside, Lillian Monroe, her mother, busied herself reorganizing the mansion's library. She'd taken on the role of its caretaker, breathing life back into spaces long forgotten. Evelyn stepped inside, grinning as she watched her mother gently wipe dust from old photographs. "Can you believe it, Mum?" she said, her eyes sparkling with joy. "A year ago, I was just a gardener who knew nothing about my past. And now we're a family." Lillian paused, her gaze tender yet filled with emotion. "My daughter deserves this," she said, "and so does Nathaniel, after all he's lost." Though content with her newfound life, Evelyn knew she couldn't simply settle as an heiress to the Hayes estate. She wanted to do something bigger, something that could touch more lives. One evening, over dinner with Nathaniel and Lillian, she spoke up. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, meeting Nathaniel's eyes. "I want to do something meaningful with my life." Nathaniel set his wine glass down, listening intently. "I want to turn this garden into an ecological center," Evelyn continued. "A place where people can learn about nature, how to care for plants, and most importantly, where those less fortunate can find work and new opportunities." Lillian squeezed her daughter's hand, moved by her vision. "That's so you, Evelyn, always wanting to help others." Nathaniel considered it for a moment, then smiled. "It's a bold plan, but I believe you can do it." "So you're on board?" Evelyn asked, her excitement bubbling over. Nathaniel nodded. "Not just on board, I'll help you make it happen." Evelyn's heart swelled with joy. She hadn't just found her family, she'd discovered her true purpose. Nathaniel Hayes, once a man isolated by years of solitude, was transformed. He spent more time with Lillian and Evelyn, no longer burying himself in work. Dinners at the mansion were no longer silent. They echoed with laughter and heartfelt stories. One morning, as Nathaniel strolled through the garden, Benson, the faithful butler of nearly 30 years, approached him. "Sir," Benson said, his voice warm, "I've served the Hayes family for almost 3 decades. And I've never seen you this happy." Nathaniel looked out at the garden where Evelyn was teaching a group of children how to plant seeds. Lillian prepared tea on the porch, her eyes alight with contentment. He smiled. "Maybe because I've finally found what I've been searching for all along." A year later, Lillian's garden, an ecological center named in honor of her mother, opened its gates. Evelyn took the helm, pouring her knowledge and love for nature into helping those in need. Nathaniel continued his business ventures, but devoted more time to his family. Lillian, who'd once left the mansion in sorrow, returned as the cornerstone of Nathaniel's world. And Evelyn, the girl who once thought herself just an ordinary gardener, had uncovered the true meaning of her life. At the center's opening ceremony, Nathaniel stood beside Lillian and Evelyn, admiring the vibrant flower beds. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice thick with pride. Evelyn clasped her mother's and father's hands, smiling brightly. "And this is only the beginning." Spring arrived with gentle breezes, weaving through the vibrant blossoms of the Hayes Mansion garden. The entire estate buzzed with preparations for a momentous occasion, the wedding of Nathaniel Hayes and Lillian Monroe. Evelyn stood in the heart of the garden, where she'd once laid the first stones to revive its beauty. Today it sparkled like never before, adorned with soft white ribbons draped across the trees, elegant tables set beneath lush green canopies, and a small stage where Nathaniel and Lillian would exchange their vows. She could hardly believe that just a year ago she'd been an anonymous gardener. Now she was about to witness her parents' happiest moment, a reunion they'd waited over 2 decades to reclaim. "Hey, are you nervous?" A warm, familiar voice broke her reverie. Diego, the former garden overseer, stepped up beside her with a playful grin. Evelyn laughed. "Are you asking me or talking about yourself?" Diego shrugged dramatically. "Maybe both." They locked eyes and burst into laughter. After everything they'd been through, Evelyn and Diego had grown closer than ever. From afar, soft music floated through the air. Lillian emerged, radiant in a pristine white wedding gown, her face glowing with joy yet tinged with emotion. Nathaniel, sharp in a black suit, stood at the floral altar, his eyes fixed on the woman he'd loved his entire life. And then, before family, friends, and those tied to the Hayes estate, they spoke their vows. No one could hold back tears of joy. Evelyn squeezed her hands together. At last, her family was truly whole. After the ceremony, everyone gathered around the tables, savoring delicious food and sharing light-hearted stories. Nathaniel, once a stern and distant businessman, couldn't stop smiling. He raised his glass, his eyes warm with gratitude. "Thank you all for being here today," he said. "This isn't just a special day for Lillian and me. It's the day we officially become a complete family." Lillian rested her hand on his, nodding with love. Evelyn watched her parents, her heart swelling with happiness. Yet she knew her life couldn't revolve solely around the Hayes mansion forever. She had her own path to forge. After months of running Lillian's garden, the ecological center, Evelyn saw its potential to grow even further. It had become more than a garden, a sanctuary for those in need, a place offering second chances. But to realize that vision, she needed to step beyond the safety of the Hayes estate and make her own mark. One evening, she entered the study where Nathaniel sat reading. "Dad," she said softly. Nathaniel looked up, setting his book aside. "Yes, sweetheart?" Evelyn took a seat across from him. Drawing a deep breath, "I think it's time for me to leave." Nathaniel studied her, his expression not one of surprise, but of understanding. "I want to expand the ecological center into something bigger," she continued, "to take it to other regions where nature needs protecting too." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment before a gentle smile spread across his face. "I knew this day would come," he said. "Evelyn, you've always been strong and ambitious, and I'm proud of you." A tear slipped down Evelyn's cheek. "You're not upset?" "Upset?" Nathaniel chuckled. "No, my girl, I'm just worried. But I know you're brave enough to walk your own path." Lillian entered, having overheard everything. She approached Evelyn and took her hand. "Go do what you believe is right," she said. "But remember, you'll always have a home to come back to." Evelyn hugged her mother tightly, tears flowing freely. On the day she left, the entire Hayes household gathered to see her off. Nathaniel, Lillian, Benson, and all the staff watched as she loaded her bags into the car. Diego stepped up, arms crossed. "You sure about this?" Evelyn nodded, smiling, "More than ever." Diego sighed, then surprised her by pressing a small key into her hand. "What's this?" she asked, puzzled. "The key to my little house in the suburbs," he said. "If you ever need a place to rest, it's there for you." Evelyn looked at him, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you, Diego." She turned to Nathaniel and Lillian, pulling them into one last embrace. Nathaniel whispered in her ear, "Go work miracles, Evelyn." She smiled, "I'll make you proud." With that, she climbed into the car, started the engine, and drove away. In the rearview mirror, she watched her family's figures shrink into the distance. But she didn't feel sadness. This wasn't a goodbye. It was the start of a new journey, and she was ready to embrace it. And there you have it, folks. An emotional ending to today's story. Evelyn found her family, but her journey doesn't stop here. Life is full of new opportunities, and sometimes we have to step out of our comfort zones to chase our dreams. What do you think of Evelyn's decision? If it were you, would you have the courage to leave a warm, safe place to pursue your passion? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this story, hit that like button to support the channel and subscribe so you don't miss out on more captivating tales. And if this story touched you, share it with your friends and family. Turn on the notification bell for the latest videos, and thank you for joining us on this journey. See you in the next story.